Today we will be discussing the Eighth Commandment, Thou shalt not steal. We will open with an introduction. In a subsequent video we will deal with the universal destination of goods, and then a third video on the respect for persons and their goods, a fourth video on the respect for the integrity of creation, a fifth video on social justice, and then we will conclude with a sixth video where we do a summation. So expounding on the previous slide, we now look at detail at both the direct and then later the indirect causes of people stealing. We've already mentioned the lack of knowledge, a lack of moral guidance, on the bottom rung here, a lack of essentials, opportunity, both in that there may not be an ethical environment, corporate governance may be weak, and a system of internal controls may also be weak. Then also we spoke about consequence. What's the likelihood that I'm caught while committing the crime or afterwards? What's the likelihood that the crime is going to be investigated? If it is investigated, what is the likelihood that I'm going to be prosecuted? And if I'm prosecuted, what is the likelihood of a conviction? And then finally, if I'm convicted, what is the likelihood of a sentence? And here we speak about a punitive sentence and a reformative sentence. So where does this lack of knowledge or lack of moral guidance come from? It comes from a lack of education in both formal schooling, a lack of moral values passed down by the family. Very often there may be significant members of the family missing from the family setup. And these are as a result of societal issues that may be existing. And then we also have the media that propagates immoral lifestyles, etc. And then we also have a lack of church and people attending church classes, for example in the Catholic Church, like attending catechism classes for children. In the lack of moral guidance and lack of essentials, we also look at artificial shortages of essentials and social programs, the hoarding of land and foodstuffs by the wealthy, as well as tax avoidance, tax avoidance and tax evasion, which results in government not receiving all the money that it should be entitled to so that it can carry out all the programs that it should be carrying out, both in education and healthcare and youth programs. As far as opportunity and lack of essentials goes, perceptions about the universality of crime, everyone is doing it is often a motivator or justification for committing crime. Then corruption at all levels, from top people both in government and in the corporate world. There's reported crime in the media, and this results in everybody perceiving that everyone is involved in crime and therefore it's okay for me to do so as well. And then also through a lack of taxation, there may also be inadequate policing. And then we also look at, finally, in terms of the consequence and opportunity, a lack of arrests, a lack of prosecutions, a lack of convictions, and a lack of what I like to call effective sentencing, where a person serves their term, and also proper correctional facilities and programs specifically geared towards reformative justice. So the lack of education and artificial shortages of essentials and social programs, where does this come from? This may be, as we've just said already, a lack of funding or prioritization of those projects. So money is rather shifted towards defense spending. Also, parents may be too busy or too tired or too distracted. In the too distracted, we speak about focus on sports and TV rather than on children. The media is misleading and idolizing entrepreneurs and capitalists. And then also the continued secularization, specifically in the Western world, where we move away from the church and God. On the other side, perceptions about the universality of crime and the lack of consequence. We look at greed and avarice, and then also legality versus morality. It's not illegal. Yes, it may not be illegal, but it may very much be immoral. We've already touched on tax avoidance, tax evasion. Tax avoidance may be legal, but it may be immoral. Tax evasion certainly is illegal and therefore definitely immoral. And then tax avoidance, which is a term often used to describe the grey area in between the legal tax avoidance, but immoral, and the illegal tax evasion. Then also a lack of arrests, prosecution, convictions, and effective jail time may be through a lack of adequate funding for those relevant departments, both in policing, in the justice system, and in the correctional system. Then ultimately, all of this leads to what I may term a lack of God. So, those were the direct causes of crime. The indirect causes are the control of policy-making bodies. That the criminals, stroke wealthy, may very much be in control of the policy-making bodies, be they government, etc. There's the exploitation of middle and lower classes, and distraction through entertainment, both the media and specifically sports. On the other side, we look at lawyers and lobbyists who negatively influence lawmaking and lawmakers, and then also those corporations that view themselves as being above the law, just too big to fail, as we saw in the 2009 credit crunch, which without a doubt is one of the single biggest fraud cases that man has experienced. In the control of policy-making bodies, we then go into the inadequate, effective taxation of the wealthy, the funneling of public funds to the wealthy through public spending and tax breaks, and also the control and manipulation of the media, often through ownership. We look at the purposeful underutilization of arable land, and also the misutilization of arable land in that we make food for animals rather than people. And then tax policy, tax avoidance, and the effective prosecution and sentencing of illegal tax evasion. The lawyers and lobbyists, policing effort is focused on petty crimes, so we look for the guy who's stolen an apple, who's broken into your house, and not on the commercial crimes of huge negative consequences like the credit crunch. And then also in America we have seen liberal deregulation of the finance industries. And then finally a lack of tax funding for policing, justice and corrections and their associated programs. And then finally we get to the top tier, where everybody's focused on the short-term gain versus the long-term view, through a lack of knowledge, the inappropriate role models and education of everybody, but especially the wealthy, through a lack of moral guidance, putting self before others, in other words greed or avarice, and then focus on profits without measuring the real costs both to society and the environment, and then also appropriate education rather than just offering one option, which is capitalism, dog eat dog, man eat man. In this first slide, we ask the question, why do people steal? What is the underlying cause? So first we look at the direct causes, and then we look more in depth at the indirect causes. In the direct causes, I believe that people steal things and commit these crimes because they have a lack of knowledge about what is right or wrong, and they have a lack of moral guidance. Then also there is opportunity. in that the crime presents itself through a lack of policing or slack security, etc., and also a lack of consequence. In the lack of consequence, there are two parts: the chance of being caught, and then also the consequences of being caught. So, in other words, will the case be investigated? Will I be arrested? If I'm arrested, will I be convicted? If I'm convicted, what will my sentence be? And then the other reason why people commit crime, not all, but some people, is because they have a lack of essentials. They have no food, they have no housing, they may have no clothing. In so much as they have no food, they obviously suffer from hunger. In so much as they have a lack of housing, they may get cold, be exposed to the elements. In so much as they lack clothing, they may lack self-esteem as a result. Why else do people steal? Through greed. Sometimes also because there's a lack of funding or prioritization for programs that would not require you to steal. One thinks of social programs and social grants like we've implemented here in South Africa, and has seen a significant decrease in petty crimes. Started speaking in the slide about the lack of knowledge or moral guidance, and I put it down to a lack of God. Not a lack of religion, a lack of God. Then also the powers that be also have a lack of appropriate education. All education in the Western world is about capitalism and about getting out the maximum for the minimum input. It's all about production rather than sustaining production capacity. And then finally, the powers that be also have a lack of appropriate role models. We hold people up like big capitalists that make a lot of money and are successful in so much as they make a lot of money, and seldom do we idolize or praise people who are more pursued with the common good. One thinks of perhaps somebody like Sister Teresa amongst others. In this slide we look at first the direct causes of crime, and then we look at the underlying indirect causes of crime. So on the bottom rung, in the direct causes of crime, we have already discussed a lack of knowledge, a lack of moral guidance, a lack of essentials, the opportunity, the relative ethical environment, corporate governance and internal controls. On the consequence side, we've already discussed the chance of being caught, the chance of your case being investigated, a subsequent prosecution, a subsequent successful conviction, and then effective sentencing in both the punitive and reformative justice models. In the lack of knowledge and lack of moral guidance, we look to the lack of education, both informal schooling, school overcrowding, understaffing, etc. We look at family influences in specific situations where families may not be in the traditional sense and significant member or members of the family may be missing. Very often these are as a result of societal causes or situations. We look at the media and its influence, and then also the lack of church going and church education in the form of, in example, the Catholic Church catechism classes for the youth. And the lack of moral guidance and the lack of essentials, insofar as those overlap, the artificial shortages of essentials and social programs through hoarding and tax avoidance and tax evasion, which may lead to the underpayment of tax and therefore the underfunding of these social programs. in the lack of essentials and the opportunity presenting itself for crime. There's the perceptions about the universality of crime, with the justification that everyone is doing it, and then also the perceptions and real corruption taking place both in government and in the corporate world, as well as inadequate policing. Also, when we look at opportunity and consequence, we've already discussed the lack of arrests, prosecutions, convictions, effective sentencing, as well as appropriate and adequate correctional facilities and correctional programs, specifically around reformative justice. As far as lack of education and artificial shortages of essential goods is often around the lack of funding, prioritization. Very often parents are too busy or too tired or too distracted to give their kids moral values. The media, and specifically around sports, is misleading and idolizing the wrong people, and then also the continued secularization, specifically as we see in Europe. On the other side, we have greed and avarice, legality versus morality, and just as tax avoidance may be legal, it may also be immoral, and so much as tax evasion is absolutely illegal. But then these continue because of a lack of arrest, prosecution, convictions, and effective jail time. Ultimately, these take place because of a lack of God. On the other side, on the upside, on the indirect causes of crime, it is those criminals stroke wealthy that are in control of policy-making bodies that exploit the middle and lower classes and distract both the middle and lower classes through entertainment, through the media, and specifically sports. On the other side, specifically on the legal side, lawyers and lobbyists may negatively influence lawmaking, and very often corporations view themselves as being above the law and too big to fail. And the control of policy-making bodies may result in inadequate effective taxation of the wealthy, and also funneling of public funds to the wealthy through public spending and tax breaks, as well as the control and manipulation of the media, very often through ownership. Also continuing therein, purposeful underutilization of arable land, the misutilization of arable land, making food for animals rather than people, and also tax policy avoidance and effective prosecution and sentencing of tax evasion. On the lawyers and lobbyists, policing effort is focused on petty crimes and not on commercial crimes of huge negative consequences, like the credit crunch of 2009, and also the liberal deregulation of the financial industry and sector, specifically in the US. And then also lack of tax funding for policing, justice, and correctional facilities and their associated programs. So ultimately, the lack of knowledge is because people look at a short-term gain versus a long-term view. Inappropriate role models and education of everybody, but especially the wealthy. People putting themselves before others, focus on profits without measuring the real costs to both society and the environment, and then also appropriate education. All education is geared and offers only one model, and that is capitalism, dog eat dog and man eat man. Just to recap in this last slide what we will be covering in subsequent slides. The second video will be on the universal destination of goods. The third video will be on the respect for persons and their goods. The fourth video will be on the respect for the integrity of creation. The fifth video will be about social justice. And the sixth video will be a summation of all the other videos.